Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the AIA 2019 Documents, Understanding the Changing Roles of the Construction Manager. This is a webinar brought to you by AIA Contract Documents, and this webinar will focus on the new release of Construction Manager as Constructor Documents. This presentation is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws. And this program is registered with the AIA for one learning unit. When you registered for the webinar, you entered your AIA member number if applicable. So we will use that information to report your credit. Please allow at least 2 weeks for your credit to appear on your online transcript. Also, you will receive a follow-up email. The follow-up email will contain the recording of today's session along with the PowerPoint slides. So you will be receiving the PDF of the PowerPoint slides along with the recording. You can also view the recording on our Learn page. With no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Susan Van Bell. Susan, please take it over.
Thank you, Husty. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and we're very delighted you could join us today. I'm Susan Van Bell. I'm Senior Director and Counsel for the AIA Contract Documents Content Program, and with me today is Arlen Solacek, FAIA. Arlen was co-chair of the Documents Committee Task Group that updated the construction management documents that we'll be talking about, so we're very fortunate to have Arlen with us today. Slide 5, please. So I'm not going to go over the learning objectives for the program in great detail. I'm sure you looked at them when you signed up, but basically we are going to talk about the relationships between the owner, architect, and construction manager as they are linked through the documents in the construction manager as constructor family. We will discuss the 2019 updates and provide you with a little more knowledge about these documents that will help meet the challenges in construction manager as constructor delivery. Slide 6. The other two items we will talk about are 2 new exhibits that we have published with these documents this year that won't be familiar to you. One is an insurance and bonds exhibit, and one is a new sustainable projects exhibit. Slide 7. So I just want to begin with a brief overview of the documents program. We find that our listeners often enjoy hearing a little bit about our process. Slide 8. So the documents have been published as standard form documents since 1888. We have updated them on a regular basis and developed new documents that have reflected changes in the construction industry, changes in practice, as well as interpretive case law. Our documents program has grown over the years, reflecting the complexity of the construction industry and the number of documents, and the participants in the drafting and revision process has also grown. We now publish over 200 agreements and forms. Slide 9. So our drafting objectives when we are working on the documents is to maintain them as what we consider to be the industry standard, to create documents that we consider to be fair and balanced, and we do that through a process of soliciting review and comment on the documents from industry stakeholders who are not just AIA member architects, but any stakeholders involved in the documents that we are publishing. We balance the competing interests of those stakeholders, and then we allocate risk where it is best managed, and that often has to do with what would be insurable risk and who would be carrying the insurance. Next slide, please. So our drafting process, first bullet, always seeking improvement, which we are. And when it's time to update a document family or develop a new document, we generally will go out to industry stakeholders, ask them for their comments on the existing document or the new issue we are planning to address. We also do market research and seek input from various sources to assist us with updating the document. So it's really an iterative process where we go out to the industry, we prepare a first draft, we send the draft out to various liaisons for comments, it comes back, we review the comments, and so forth until we've come up with a version that we feel like has addressed all of the relevant issues, and then our documents committee approves the document. Slide 11, please. So I've already mentioned this a little bit, but the participants in our drafting process, market research, the industry stakeholders, we look at AIA member resources such as knowledge communities, we reach out to liaison and subject matter experts, and then we have our documents committee, which is composed of about 30 volunteer architects from around the country and from different practice types and sizes, and they work with our in-house attorneys as well as with outside counsel and legal advisors to draft the documents. And now I'll turn it over to Arlen, who will provide you with an overview of the construction management delivery method.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you, Hasti. Let's get going with our discussion on the construction manager project delivery and associated AIA construction manager document families. Next slide, Hasti. Owners now have a much wider choice of construction delivery options beyond traditional bid. Nearly 3/4 of project delivery decisions are made before design begins, when owners are able to look at the risks associated with the project and then weigh advantages or disadvantages of potential delivery methods. Alternative delivery like design build, construction manager constructor, and construction manager advisor have become more attractive to owners who want to reduce disputes and claims as well as obtain better budget and schedule results. Construction manager as constructor, which I'm often going to call CMC for short, has become one of the most popular delivery options. Just over 1/3 of all non-residential construction now is being provided through CMC. In 2018, there was almost $1.3 trillion of CMC delivered construction, and it's been growing at nearly 5% annually. Next slide, Hasti. Design and construction projects are requiring many more parties, making the resulting project structure pretty complex. Most of you are already familiar with the traditional design bid build shown in the diagram, where our owner selects the architect first to design the project and produce the construction documents. The owner then solicits bids to select a contractor. The A201, the gray rectangle in the middle of the diagram, then provides the general conditions that define and coordinate the roles, responsibilities, and relationships between the owner, architect, and contractor. For this and the following relationship diagrams we'll look at, we've also shown the primary agreement numbers between the parties, as well as showing all of the documents that are used in the family, and that's all in the print on the bottom. That's probably too small for everybody to read. So keep this traditional project delivery in mind as we look at the other delivery options. Next. First, let's look at CMC, the topic of our discussion today. You see that the parties and relationships pretty much are the same as in traditional bid. The difference is that the construction manager will be present during design phase, and that's generally called pre-construction phase, and then provides the construction. You see those dual roles with the two colors in the CMC box on the diagram. The center rectangle still is the same A201 that applies during construction phase, but there's now additional agreements between the owner and construction manager that help establish the additional pre-construction phase responsibilities. Next. Next one, Hasti. Thank you. During the pre-construction phase, the construction manager acts in an advisory role, providing expertise in cost estimating and scheduling, constructability and bidability reviews of the architect documents, subcontractor selection, and even early releases of work. Once the construction price proposal is offered and accepted by the owner, the construction manager converts to a traditional contractor role. There are two pricing options available under CMC. There's one that caps the owner's cost exposure through a guaranteed maximum price, or GMP. The cap cost proposal uses the A133 Owner Construction Manager Agreement. And when the pricing option is a pure cost of the work with no cap, the A134 agreement is used. We'll be discussing the A133 and 134 agreements a little bit later. Next. The last option that we'll show, but we're going to discuss only very briefly, is Construction Manager Advisor, or what we'll call CMA. CMA is appropriate when an owner uses multiple direct-to-owner contracts to build a project. The project now incorporates a fourth primary player, the Construction Manager Advisor, on the project team. This makes the diagram, as well as the entire delivery process, more complicated than traditionally bid. The A232, the General Conditions Agreement for CMA, which is now again shown in the center gray rectangle, coordinates the roles and responsibilities of all the parties during construction, but has been written to take into account the CMA's role and multiple contractors on the project. Asti, next slide. Very briefly, these are the key attributes for CMA delivery. We're not going to spend any time on these today, but we provide them here for your reference. Under CMA, the construction manager is retained at the start of the project and acts as an advisor to the architect and owner during pre-construction. Unlike in CMC, the construction manager advisor doesn't provide construction services. But once the construction begins, the CMA assumes many of the general contractor's roles to manage and coordinate the work between the multiple contractors. Susan and I have a separate webinar on the CMA family scheduled for December 3rd, where we'll go into much more detail. Please join us for that. Next slide. A lot of us don't use the term construction manager as constructor. It's pretty much a tongue tie in a lot of cases. AIA tries to use general descriptive titles for their document families. In our own task group, we realized that there were a lot of names used for CMC delivery. There's CM at risk, CMGC, and GCCM, again, General Contractor Construction Manager, for example. These often are local or regional preferences, but they all fall under the AIA CMC family. AIA often receives calls asking whether there is a CM at risk set of documents. And for us, CM at risk is just one of the forms of CMC, with the at risk meaning that there's a GMP cap on the contract sum. Next, Susan will be going to describe the approach that AIA uses to draft and update their forms and agreements. Susan?
Thank you, Arlen. Slide 20, Hasti. So the drafting goals for the CM documents are the same as the ones I discussed earlier, are general drafting goals. But for this specific group of documents, they're updated on a 10-year cycle. So the current versions were published in 2009, and now we have the 2019 versions. The 2009 versions will be phased out in 18 months. And the 2019 are available now. They are based on the same principles, again, that I already mentioned. And the other thing is that we update our design bid build family, which is the A201 General Conditions family, also in a 10-year cycle. And so the last A201 family revision was in 2017. And so to the extent that any of the revisions made in the A201 family documents would apply in the CM documents, those edits are then carried forward. Slide 21, please. So, I talked about seeking industry feedback. So, of course, for updating the construction management documents, we sought out feedback from practitioners in construction management. We talked with major CM firms and construction companies who are doing CMC work, which is, coming on in the pre-construction phase and then performing the construction of the project. or we also talked with the CMAA when we updated the CMA documents, as well as CSI, and many attorneys representing owners, lenders, and other stakeholders who are mostly members of the ABA Forum on Construction Law. So we ask our outside liaisons, what changes would you like to see to the existing documents, which were the 2009, and then what practice changes have occurred over the last 10 years that they feel needs to be addressed now in the updated documents. And so Arlen now will talk with you about the actual updates that we made.
Thanks, Susan. Let's get into more detail now for CMC, and that's the reason we're all here today. Next slide, Hasti. Recall the slide from a couple of minutes ago that shows the contractual structure and relationships in the CMC project. Again, it's very similar to the layout and relationships of traditional bid. The major difference, again, is that the construction manager provides both pre-construction phase advising services and then constructs the project. Next slide. Each family of documents that AIA produces contains a full set of agreements and forms that have been carefully written and coordinated with each other. It's also why we need to be really careful when we're editing any of the documents, since changes in one also may affect the roles and responsibilities in the other documents. So here are the primary documents we use in the CMC family. There are two options for the owner CMC agreement that cover pre-construction phase services through the cost proposal acceptance. Again, one for a GMP and one for pure cost of the work without a cap. The owner-architect agreement now includes additional responsibilities between the architect and construction manager. We've produced a new sustainable projects exhibit that includes CMC responsibilities during pre-construction phase as well as their normal construction responsibilities, and Susan will discuss that exhibit in a couple of minutes. There's also a guide for supplementary general conditions that provides language for special situations and guidance in preparing general conditions and construction agreements. The updated A503 also has a brand new appendix that offers suggested edits to the general conditions for cost of the work projects, and we'll get to that in a minute. Next slide, Hasti. Quickly, here's some of the advantages of CMC project delivery. There is no single construction delivery that is best for all projects in all circumstances. We'll usually find CMC used on a large or complicated project, especially one that needs a high level of similar project experience due to technical complexity. We'll see it on projects that are schedule sensitive or projects with difficult or unusual site constraints. It takes both a more experienced contractor and more experienced owner to successfully manage and use CMC delivery. Last, a big advantage of CMC is that the contractor often is selected based on qualifications, not just price. So in theory, we hope that we see more teamwork, a smaller number of changes during construction, and fingers crossed, far fewer claims in the project. Next slide. The pre-construction phase starts with the owner selecting both the architect and construction manager. The architect services generally are pretty traditional design, construction documents, and contract administration, but there's a lot of additional interaction and coordination with the CMC. To provide the most benefit, the construction manager should be selected as early as possible so that the project team benefits from the contractor's experience, the cost estimating, and schedule input during design phase. Note that the order of retaining the architect in the CMC is not necessarily the architect first, but that really seems to be the most common in our experience. Next slide. As we noted, once the construction phase begins, the construction manager then transitions to a traditional general contractor role. CMC allows, and I really personally recommend, a very rigorous subcontractor screening and selection process where you can select subcontractors based on qualifications, experience, and resource ability, not just a low price. Subcontractors also can be selected early during the design phase to bring specific expertise and design assistance to our projects. Both of these opportunities significantly improve the chances for a successful project. Next slide. Next, let's talk a little bit about the owner CMC agreement. This one, the A133, defines the roles and responsibilities of the construction manager during the pre-construction phase, then as the GMP is offered, and finally as the project moves into construction. Remember this important difference from a traditional bid project where the contractor only enters the project only when the bid is received. Let's look first at the A133 agreement that contains a GMP, or a guaranteed maximum price, that generally caps the owner's cost risk. For many of us who asked about and use CM at risk, the A133 is the document that we'd be using. For the 2019 update, we made some organizational changes to the agreement. We added an initial information selection at the beginning that provides project data, similar to what you see in the owner-architect agreement. We also changed the order and renamed a couple of the sections so that they better match up with the construction agreement that will be signed later in the project. Next slide. This is one of the more important changes that AIA made to their 2017 and 2019 documents. With BIM and the exchange of digital data between parties becoming much more commonplace, all of the agreements now emphasize the need to develop the protocols and reach agreements for the use of and reliance upon digital data. Note particularly, and it's important to read the second bullet point, this new requirement, which is in pretty much all of the agreements, cautions that parties are at their own risk, their own sole risk, without liability to or from anybody else, if all or a portion of the building information model is used without the digital data agreements. We are finding BIM models being exchanged without any agreement, and it really created the opportunity for a lot of problems. Next slide. One of the many things that our task group also wrestled with was how much detail we should provide in the base agreement to define the pre-construction phase services. Again, we asked for input from a lot of construction managing firms and found a wide variety of approaches, service scopes, but frankly, very little consistency between them. From the interviews, one change that they wanted was a way to tailor the documents for the scope of their pre-construction services without having a lot of restrictive language that they always would need to edit. So our revisions address this issue by providing a series of fill points in the owner CM agreement where all of the pre-construction phase services descriptions either can be inserted or can be attached and referenced. Even so, we did identify a number of tasks that expanded the construction manager's responsibilities that reflect what we're seeing as modern project delivery. Next slide. Also, as a reflection of what we saw as current practice, the construction manager now is an early participant in developing the BIM and digital data protocols that we just talked about. We're also seeing a lot more design phase input from the construction manager, subcontractors, and suppliers, and a lot of times you'll hear this called design assist. Discussion with the CM during the design phase also can help identify what work will become delegated design through a performance specification, where the final design or engineering is going to be completed by the contractor or their subcontractors. And last, since the construction manager very often is selected based on their proposed personnel, we have added the requirement for an initial and then updated staffing plans throughout the project to make sure we're keeping the staff that we originally saw. Next slide. This is another modification that we felt was important to reflect the changing role of the construction manager. With the CMC providing advice and consulting during the pre-construction phase, our task group felt it was appropriate to include a standard of care reflecting the professionalism that we thought ought to be associated with this role. Because there is no standard of care for CMs in the same sense that architects and engineers have one, this standard of care is more general than the one we have for professional registrants. Next, we've also added similar insurance requirements to design that the design consultants have. So the construction manager now also has insurance requirements during design phase, including commercial general liability, automobile liability, and workman's compensation. A new addition that we made starting in the 2017 documents and now in the 2019 documents also is a requirement for the construction manager to carry professional errors and omissions insurance, and that will cover the designer engineering that the contractor will provide through delegated design and performance specifications. Next slide, please, Hasti. Another advantage in CMC delivery is our ability to fast-track work or create early release packages. This can be as simple as early ordering long lead time equipment, locking in materials pricing and escalating markets, to actually releasing and starting some portion of the work while the balance of the project is still in design or construction documents. While the start of construction is pretty black and white in traditional bid, it's really a gray area in CMC work when it begins. Also, from our conversations with construction managers, we found that same lack of common approach for how to do early release work, including what kind of agreement that we should use and what that agreement should contain. All that we could agree upon was that the early release must be by written agreement, and then we've offered some suggestions for what should be included in that discussion. Next slide. Recall that the A201 general conditions for construction that we updated in 2017 is also used for the CMC projects once construction begins. The bullet points here are the most important changes that we made in the 2017 update to the general conditions. But rather than spend a lot of time today discussing all of the changes, if you're interested to learn more about it, there are comparatives and webinars on the AIA Documents Learn website that'll take you through the details. Next, Susan's going to continue with some of the other changes that we made in 2019. Susan, take it away.
Thank you, Orlin. Slide 36, please, Hasti. So A133 has an Exhibit A, which is the Guaranteed Maximum Price Amendment. And this is an amendment that is filled out and agreed to by the owner prior to the start of construction. The revisions that were made to the GMP Amendment for A133 generally conform to revisions that were made in A102 2017, which is the owner-contractor agreement for a cost of the work plus a fee with a guaranteed maximum price in the design bid build family of documents. One of the major changes that was made was to include fill points for substantial completion of the entire work of the project or substantial completion of portions of the work. The latter is new. We didn't used to have fill points where the owner could identify a substantial completion date for portions of the work, and so that is now in the GMP amendment. Slide 37, please. A133 now has a new exhibit, the Insurance and Bonds exhibit, and that is Exhibit B. The Insurance and Bonds exhibit follows an exhibit that was developed for the 2017 owner-contractor agreements, and if you have used that exhibit in the 2017 agreements, it's pretty much the same content-wise. This provides the construction phase insurance requirements. Arlen already talked about the pre-construction phase insurance requirements. The pre-construction phase requirements are in the agreement itself. The construction phase requirements are in the exhibit. And part of why we developed this exhibit in 2017 was that we thought a standalone insurance document would be useful for the parties to be able to take to their insurance advisors and go over it and, decide what insurance coverages should be provided. So basically, it's structured so that there are two types of insurance coverages that are both for the owner and for the construction manager. for each you have mandatory coverages. So for the owner, it's things like general liability and property insurance. For the construction manager, it's things like the CGL, the auto, the employer's liability. And then there are also checkboxes and a list of optional coverages that the parties could select, and those may depend on the nature of the project. And those would be things like pollution insurance, cyber insurance, and part of the rationale for that list and those checkboxes was to help facilitate a conversation. There may be insurance coverages listed there that the parties haven't really thought about, but when they see that on the checklist, they might think about, maybe we should include this type of insurance. And then, of course, you would put in the requirements for the performance and the payment bonds in this exhibit. Slide 38, please. So most of the insurance requirements used to be in Article 11 of A201, and in the 2017 release, many of them were moved into the insurance and bonds exhibit, and so of course for A133 and A134, that's true as well, because those use A201 as the general conditions. What remains in A201 are things like the obligation to purchase insurance, so that if the parties don't complete the exhibit, they're prompted to purchase insurance in A201, a required notice of cancellation or failure to obtain insurance, the waiver of subrogation, and the settlement of an insured loss. And there's a specific procedure that is set forth in A201 that talks about that settlement. Next slide, please, 39. So now we're moving on to the other owner CMC agreement, which is A134. This is cost of the work plus a fee without a guaranteed maximum price. Slide 40. So what is the difference between A133 and A134? Well, the main difference is whether there is a cap on the amount that the construction manager will be paid for performing the work. So under A133, the guaranteed maximum price is the cap. The CM is paid for its allowable costs incurred in performing the work plus its fee up to the GMP. Once the cost of the work plus the fee exceeds the GMP, the CM is at risk and will not be reimbursed by the owner. So in A134, there is no such cap. There's no GMP. The CM is paid for its allowable costs incurred in performing the work plus its fee, and there's no limit on the owner's liability for paying those costs. So for those of you who may be using the A201 family design bid build documents, it's really the difference between A103 and A102, one of which has the GMP and the other doesn't. So without a GMP, what is the mechanism for monitoring costs in A134? It's a control estimate, and the control estimate is used as part of a detailed system of cost control that is implemented by the CM before the first application for payment, and it has to be approved by the owner. That's used in lieu of the statement of values that would be used under a stipulated sum or a GMP contract. The cost estimate is updated and submitted with each successive month's application for payment, and it allows the owner to determine if the costs that the contractor has incurred during the previous month have been consistent with those that were previously predicted. This allows the owner to make appropriate adjustments to control costs and to take advantage of savings opportunities through the construction period. So A134 is best used where there's a pre-existing relationship between the owner and the contractor. Pretty obvious why that's the case. Or it might be used for a one-of-a-kind project where it would be difficult to put together a complete set of construction documents, and there's going to be a lot of design sort of on the fly. There, pure cost might be the way to go because it's harder to estimate costs. Slide 41, please. And this graph just gives you, a visual picture of the difference between A133 and A134. You can see that the guaranteed maximum price limits the amount of of cost in A133, but there's no limitation when you're using A134. Next slide, please, 42. So the 2019 revisions to A133 generally incorporated the 2017 changes to A103, which is the corollary document in the A201 family, and then the revisions made in A133 that are applicable. So Arlen has already spoken about those revisions when he was talking with you about A133. Things like the standard of care and the pre-construction insurance requirements and the fill point for pre-construction scope, all of those things are also in A134. And A134 also includes the insurance and bonds exhibit that I just talked about with respect to A133. Next slide, 43, please. So probably the most significant edit to A134 that is, was not an edit that we made in A133 and carried into A134 is the inclusion of a new section on substantial completion and the opportunity to establish a substantial completion date in the agreement. In prior versions of the document, the parties did not have a contractual obligation to address substantial completion until the CM submitted the control estimate to the owner. So based upon discussions in the documents committee and then liaison feedback, we concluded the document would benefit from providing the parties with the opportunity to either establish a date or time period for substantial completion in the agreement, or to establish a substantial completion date when the CM submits the control estimate to the owner, which is going to be later in the process. So the idea is that you could put a substantial completion date in the agreement that's earlier on, and for planning purposes that might be helpful as opposed to waiting until the control estimate is submitted. So the fill point for substantial completion that was added to A134 is at section 3.3.1.3, and then there were some edits made in the document to conform to that change. Next slide, please, 44. So now we're moving on to the other documents in the CMC family. It's a coordinated set of documents. So we have an owner-architect agreement, which is B133. Next slide, please, 45. So B133 is coordinated for use with A133 and A134. Now you have the CM on board in the pre-construction phase, which is different than design, bid, build, and so the owner-architect agreement is coordinated for that. And then once you move into the construction phase, where the CM is performing the work the same as a contractor would be in a design bid build situation, then you use A201 for your general conditions, and the architect scope in the construction phase is basically what is set forth in A201 and in the owner-architect agreement. Very much the same as it is in a design bid build. Most of the changes that were made to B133 for 2019 are changes that were made to conform to the 2017 revisions in the owner-architect agreements. The key edits were, the addition of provisions related to digital practice and BIM, which Arlen talked about that with regard to A133. Pretty much the same provisions were included in the owner-architect agreement. There's a fill point in the initial information so that the owner can identify a sustainable objective if the owner has one. A more substantial change that was made in 2017 in the owner-architect agreements, and that's reflected here, is that there was a new category of services identified, well, not really new, renamed. Previously, the owner-architect agreements had basic and additional services, and the additional services were two types. The type that you could agree upon when you're going to execute the agreement, and that way the architect could include that scope within the fee, and then additional services that come up during the course of the project that you can't negotiate in advance. That was all called additional services previously, and we realized that was a bit confusing. And so we renamed the types of services that could be negotiated in advance. We're now calling them supplemental services. And those would be things like site evaluation, programming, historic preservation. They're all listed in the table in Article 4 if you're familiar with the owner-architect agreements. And then additional services are now the items that come up during the course of construction. And then there's also an option for providing a negotiated termination fee and licensing fee where the owner terminates for convenience. So again, if you wanted to know more about the 2017 revisions to the owner-architect agreements, which are carried forward here into B133, you could view the webinar on the 2017 revisions. And Arlen's going to talk a little bit now about some changes to our supplementary conditions.
Thank you, Susan. Preparing the A201 general conditions and the owner-contractor agreements for construction really can be a challenge. I've been doing it for more than 30 years, and each one of the projects has slightly different circumstances that require some specialized information. As I said before, AIA publishes a guide for supplementary conditions that helps prepare those documents and then offers model language for a lot of the special situations. The guide is available at no cost out on the AIA website, and to find the guide, you can go to the AIA Documents site, select the Learn tab, and then find the guides under the Training and Resources. Next slide, Hasti. In traditional bid projects, again, the contract price is a fixed sum, an amount that will be paid to the contractor regardless of what their actual costs are. In contrast, CMC projects pay the contractor all of the costs that are reasonably incurred by the contractor in the proper performance of the work. These allowed costs, as well as the costs that aren't allowed, then are listed in the owner CM and the construction agreements. For decades, the regular A201 general conditions has been used for CMC delivery, even though it really was written around fixed price agreements like traditional bid. I was part of a small work group that spent about 2 years asking a couple of questions. Were there modifications needed in the A201 regular document for cost of work agreements? And more important, would these modifications make the general conditions more responsive and clearer for cost of the work projects? We felt that there were a series of changes in language that would allow the 201 to function better, and we placed them in a separate appendix in the Supplementary General Conditions Guide. As I understand, that guide will be available shortly, and we're just cleaning up the last pieces of the language. Hasti, next slide. To give you one example of the suggested edits, the language in the left column is for contracts with the GMP, and in the right column is for projects that don't include a cost cap, a pure cost of the work project. So for example, in GMP projects, if there's a change of scope, change order may be written to adjust the GMP, and you see that language in the point 2 in the left column highlighted in yellow. For projects without a cost cap, though, we don't need a change order because the contractor simply is going to be paid for whatever costs are incurred. Consequently, we can delete the language at the point 2 item in the right column, also in the yellow highlight. However, we still should write that change order in order to document the scope change as well as any adjustments time. And all of that being said, and after 2 years of work, the plain A201 has worked pretty well for decades in CMC and still can be used without alteration if an owner chooses. Everybody has figured out how to do it. Susan's now going to continue with some of the new exhibits that we've mentioned in the exhibits to the CMC agreement. Susan?
Thank you, Arlen. And let me mention, I think we're doing pretty well on time here. If we have a few minutes at the end, we will take a few questions. If we don't have time to take questions, you're free to send Hasti your questions via email, and we will try to get back with you with the responses. Hopefully we won't be overwhelmed with questions. Okay, so moving on, slide 49. We have a new Sustainable Projects exhibit for CMC, which is E234 2019. Slide 50. Now, many of you are probably already familiar with a lot of the concepts in our Sustainable Projects materials from the original D503 guide that we had developed, and then we created SP versions of our documents. There are Sustainable Projects versions of the CMC documents. Those will be retired when the 2009 documents are retired. We've replaced those SP versions with an exhibit. And so we started that in 2017 with the A201 family, created a new Sustainable Projects exhibit, which is E204 2017. And so now we revised that and created E234 for the CMC documents, because of course we had to include the CM, and particularly in the pre-construction phase. Next slide, 51, please, Hasti. So going back to, our original iteration of Sustainable Projects, we have developed a process to achieve the owner's sustainable objective. And that includes, we have terms that we have defined that guide the parties through the process. The architect conducts a sustainability workshop to develop something called the sustainability plan, which outlines the responsibilities of each party to attain the owner's sustainable objective. And those are called the sustainable measures. And then we talk about achievement of a sustainability certification, who handles this sustainability documentation that's required, and that sort of thing. Again, many of you may already be familiar with this. But what we've done is extracted the roles of each of the parties from the SP documents and created the exhibit. And so, you have the architect conducting the sustainability workshop. You have the CM assisting with collecting the sustainability documentation and that sort of thing. And all of the agreements now have a provision that says that if the owner identifies a sustainable objective in the initial information, that the parties will then use E234 to define the responsibilities of all the parties to achieve that objective. Slide 52, please. So now the supplementary conditions, Arlen has already talked about the major change with the cost of the work edits. Next slide, 53, please, Hasti. There are two different supplementary conditions documents, so you want to be clear which one you would want to use. A503 is used for use with the CMC agreements, and then A201 as the general conditions document. A533 is for use with the CMA agreements, and the general conditions document for CMA, which is A232. CMA requires a different general conditions document because there the CM is not performing the construction, but is performing contract administration during the construction phase. And both of these supplementary conditions documents contain guidance and model language for revisions to the agreements. These documents are both available for free download on our website. Slide 54, please. Resources. I'll tell you about, we have a host of resources available for you, resources to help you understand these new documents, and so I'll go over those a little bit. Next slide, 55, please. So, of course, Hasti maintains the Learn page, which has many, many webinars that are available for you to view. We talked about the webinar on the 2017 release. This one will be available As Arlen mentioned, we'll be doing a webinar for CMA on December 3rd. That one will be recorded and posted, so there's a lot of stuff on that Learn page. If you have questions about content, you can email or call our docinfo service. There you will have someone who will answer your questions, and if necessary, we'll turn you over to one of the staff attorneys to help you. We can't give legal advice on specific fact patterns or specific disputes, but we can help a lot with things like, do you have a document for X or Y, or, you know, does my agreement address this particular situation? We understand that once you've executed your agreement and filed it a couple of years down the road, if you're running into an issue, it may not come to top of mind what your agreement said about that, and we can point you in the right direction. And then for our ACD online service, you can contact our Doc Tech support team, which are expert at helping you navigate your way through any software issues you are having. Slide 56, please. We already mentioned that we have a CMA webinar coming on December 3rd. Now, just to be clear, in the current release of documents, we have only published the construction manager as constructor documents. The construction manager's advisor documents will be published early next year, but this December 3rd webinar will give you a preview of what we've done with those documents. Slide 57, please. Comparisons. Now this slide doesn't, it's a screenshot, unfortunately it doesn't show the new comparisons which have been posted for the CMC documents, but we have posted comparison documents comparing the 2009 and 2019 versions. Basically we took the 2009 template and it shows all of the, additional language, strike-throughs, and additional language that were made to create the 2019 edition. So it makes it very easy to look at your 2009 document and then see how we changed it. There are a few explanatory notes to help you going through those comparatives. There's also a separate set of FAQs that's available on our website as well. Next slide, please, 58. This one actually shows you CMA comparisons. Again, those are not available yet. This is showing one of the current comparisons that's up. But we will be posting versions of comparatives for the new CMA documents when those documents are published. So with that, I will thank you from Arlen and I and the Contract Documents team for attending our webinar and turn it over to Hasti.
Thank you, Susan and Arlen. I have a few minutes now to go over some questions, so why don't we just go ahead and get started. Is there a predicted publication date for the 2019 CMA document?
Susan, I forget if it's certainly first quarter next year. I don't know if we've seen an actual month yet or not.
Yeah, it will be early next year.
We typically use both B101 and A101 or 102. I think they might not have asked the question fully. I'm sorry. Hold on one moment. The first part of the question is, we are a small architecture firm that also holds a general contractor's license. On some projects, we serve as both architect of record and the general contractor. Thoughts on the best agreements to use? Follow-up is, we typically use both B101 and A101 or A102.
Susan, that's probably a better question for you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Hasti. What was the part about serving as the architect and the general contractor?
So we are a small architecture firm that also holds a general contractor's license. On some projects, we serve as both architect of record and the general contractor. Thoughts on the best agreement to use?
Okay, well, it sounds to me then that you're talking about more like a design-build situation. So I would recommend that you take a look at our design-build family of documents, which do provide for design and construction under one roof. And you can go onto our website, you can look in our document synopses under design build, and you'll get a description of each of the documents in the design build family. And if that's not what you're looking for, you can go ahead and contact our docinfo service, and they'll help you with that.
Yeah,
will you address how...
I think, too, one of the things that will help is AIA also recently developed a series of design build documents for smaller projects and residential, and depending on the scale of the project the questioner was asking about, that may be easier to work with than trying to go to the full-blown multiple exhibit design build document that's really intended for much larger projects.
Yeah, that's a good point, Arlen. And the document number of the document that Arlen's referring to is A145, if you want to look that up.
Great. Here's a question I can answer. Is this webinar PMI PDU qualified? It's not something that we submit. We will report your credit for the AIA. This is qualified for one learning unit for the AIA, and we will be reporting your credit in the next 2 weeks. Another question that's coming in frequently is, will we be getting the slides or recording? You will receive a follow-up email with the slides and the recording. You can also see our Learn page to view this recording and other webinar recordings at aiacontracts.org/learn. Also, there was a question about is there a subscription available or do we have to purchase documents one at a time? There is a subscription available. You can purchase an annual single-user or multi-user license that allows you access to all of our nearly or over 200 templates and forms. You can find more information on our website, aiacontracts.org, and click on the purchase.
Yeah, and again, Hasti, as I recall, there's still the ability to buy documents one at a time if they want, and much to our surprise, we're still selling paper documents at the local chapters, so you pretty much can get the agreements and forms in any version and variety that you want.
Great. Here's another question. What happens for a project that starts under a 2009 agreement and goes beyond the 18 months? The older documents are available. Can you just change to the new change orders and substantial completion forms of the later version?
Yeah, you should be able to. You know, you can if the project starts under 2019. You can still continue to use those documents throughout the life of the project. We didn't change the change order forms and a number of the other forms that are related to CMC, so whether you use the 2009 or 2019 versions, they're going to be substantially similar.
All right, the CMC documents use the same forms that the design bid build family documents use. Some of those forms were updated in 2017, but you would be able to use them with, you know, either a 2009 agreement or a 2019 agreement. Things like G701, 702, 703, you know, the most widely used forms.
Does AIA have a matrix that lists the primary and their companion documents that are coordinated together?
If you go to the AIA resources site, AIA has published a number of listings of documents. You have an option of seeing a listing by number. You have also have an option of seeing a listing by family. And probably the one that lists the documents by family would be most useful in this circumstance, and that would give you the ability to see any of the documents that are needed in that family.
Okay, so it is the 4 o'clock hour. Let's answer 2 more questions, and then we will end the call. We are planning to use a BIM execution plan instead of the E203. Do you see a problem with that? All consultants in CM have never used the E203 and do not see the need.
No, I think the objective of listing the e-documents in our contracts and agreements was to give parties a place to start, but they're not by any means the only way of approaching those. The important thing is to have the protocol agreements in place, and if you have another set of forms that works for you and you've worked with before, that by and large accomplishes what we want, which is to provide agreement for all parties before we start exchanging data.
And,
yeah, I would just caution that if you were going to do that, I believe you'd have to make an edit to your agreements where the agreements say you're using E203. You'd have to change that to indicate whatever it is that you're using.
Easy change.
Okay. Great. And with that, let us go ahead and end this call. Again, I want to thank both Susan and Arlen for their presentation. I'd like to thank all the attendees for participating today. If you have any follow-up questions, you can email me directly from the follow-up email we will be sending you by the end of the week with the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. And again, your credit to the AIA, if you indicated your AIA member number, will be reported and it will appear on your online transcript. So again, thank you all and have a great afternoon.